Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you a very special program tonight. A presidential debate unlike anything you have ever seen or heard. This is going to be fun, it's going to be educational, and it's going to be entertaining. Well, at least more fun and educational than Trump and Biden, although probably not as entertaining. Welcome to the Convince Me Show. Welcome in. Sorry for that music mix up, but hey, in the favor of Trump and Biden and what we know as presidential debates nowadays, going off the rails is pretty much the norm. Welcome to another week of the Convince Me Show. I'm Andy Rutherford, joined as always by Mr. Casey Elrod, Mr. Brian Bennett. This is going awful. Gentlemen, how's it going?
Right. I got to admit something. I cannot tell a lie. I'm incapable of it.
I think that in and of itself is a lie, but I guess we shall see. So guys and gals, it is election week. If you're watching this on the Facebook preview, this is election night. If you're listening to this on Wednesday or watching on YouTube Wednesday or after, I hope this is a little bit of a ray of light in the middle of the chaos that I assume is going on, regardless of what happens. But this week, we don't go political on this show. Politics aren't our thing, but we're going to make an exception for things that are at least 7 years ago. And as a special treat to you guys tonight, number one, I'm calling it No Shill Week. I'm not going to do it. No shill this week. Partially because Facebook has made me mad. Oh, Bennett, never mind. We're spilling. That is amazing.
That's really good.
Yeah, I need that PDF to put on our page. Well, okay, I am going to shill. Facebook.com/Convince Me Show. We're there every Tuesday night for the preview. You can find us over on Twitter at Convince Me Show.
Oh gosh, this show has led to Hades in the handbasket already.
Occasionally, we get lazy and let you guys pick the topics, and that's where you can find the occasional poll as listed there. We're on Instagram, Convince Me Show. As you can see from Bennett's graphic, nothing special happens there, but you should still follow us there anyway. And of course, every week, the entire show drops in video format over on YouTube at tinyurl.com/Convince Me Show. Wow,
Good job.
That's amazing, Bennett. Those of you listening on the podcast just missed his awesome graphic that I almost just would have went completely over by doing.
I did that at work today.
But yeah, I didn't even tell you guys this. Facebook did not approve our ad for this show because it was
Politics,
and they could not determine the source. I put in
Source was me.
I put in for an appeal. I haven't heard anything. Maybe the ad is up and running by the time this drops. Maybe not. But
wait a minute. It's Bennett is obviously a Russian. That's the reason why it was denied. That's what it was.
I think so.
Maybe.
Any truth to these claims?
In Soviet Russia, Facebook post you.
Fair enough.
Oh gosh.
All right, guys, that was number one. Number one was this is No Shill Week, and then I gave you the shill. Announcement number two is this. We know that we really suck at keeping these shows in a short, listenable time frame. Last week we were going to strive to keep it short. Our guest did not help in that matter. And we still went 2 hours. That's not going to happen today. If you guys will remember, if you've been with us from the beginning, we used to have time limits on these topics. We're bringing them back tonight. Now, unfortunately for our moderator, Mr. Bennett, he's the one in charge of enforcing these. And if you've seen any presidential debates lately, that's not a position anybody wants to be in that moderator role.
Time out. Do I get a mute button for you?
No. But I do have one for you since we record this through my computer. But anyway.
Maybe Elrod's computer will cut back out again.
Yeah.
Maybe your own computer will mute you. But we're going back to time limits tonight. Bennett is in charge. And if you haven't been picking up what we're laying down on this election week, we're looking at two of the most notorious presidents in our country's history. They are both forever monumentized, if that's a word, in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. Both of their faces appear on Mount Rushmore. Both of their faces appear on our currency, both in coin and paper form. We're talking about two presidents that almost anybody would argue are probably 1A and 1B when it comes to their significance in United States history. Tonight, we are looking at the father of our country, General George Washington, against the great liberator, the great orator, the honest Abraham Lincoln. And if you can tell by those hideous facial expressions on Mr. Elrod, he will be arguing for General Washington. I will be honored, arguing for Mr. Abraham Lincoln, and Mr. Bennett will be our esteemed moderator for the evening. Mr. Bennett, are you ready to handle this task placed before you?
I'm going to try my best.
Well, how are we determining an order, good sir?
All right. Question for tonight. I hope y'all got y'all's pen and paper as per usual.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be an Abraham Lincoln question. But I think it could apply to both of y'all to make it somewhat fair. Here's the question. One of the most iconic and well-known speeches in American history was given on November 19th, 1863. We know it as the Gettysburg Address. Without going over, if both y'all go over, we're going straight to closing arguments. Maybe. Okay, maybe not. Without going over, tell me how many words are in said Gettysburg Address. If you both go over, then I guess I'll pick the one that's closest, or maybe I'll go by who has the most creative handle name, even though nobody else can see it but us. We'll figure something out.
I'm going to think out loud just for entertainment purposes so that we are not dead air here.
Do you want to like some sort of help?
No, I've got my answer locked in.
We had Mr. Bennett and I don't know if Mr. Elrod, the young group, did, but we had to recite this address when we were in the 8th. Was it 7th grade or 8th grade?
It was 8th grade.
8th grade. So I remember it's not terribly long.
It's not terribly long. I never did memorize that whole entire thing.
Okay. I changed my answer.
I think I just took like the C on that one because I couldn't remember all that.
Okay.
407 years ago, our fathers, and then I drift off, and then
brought forth on this continent a new nation.
Look at Bennett go. Whoa.
I know it ends with
liberty.
I always got tripped up at the end. I know it's for the people, by the people, of the people. I can't ever remember the order.
Okay. You got an answer right?
Sounded good.
I'm changing it, but yeah, I've got one.
Okay. We got 856.
Whoa.
Whoa, you went way high.
Whoa.
Well,
that's better than my original answer was 1776.
Whoa. Wasn't that the year that America was discovered?
It would have been appropriate. Doing great.
Correct answer. 272 words.
Oh, just a bit outside.
Do I get bonus points for being within 100? Being within 100 there, I was 98 off.
And he was the closest.
Yep.
Right. You have one. You can go first, or you can go second.
Considering that General Washington was our first president, I find it only fair that he go first.
That does seem fair. That does seem pretty fair. That's probably how we should have done that without the.
That means I get to go 16th.
True. All right, Elrod, you're first. Let me hear your opening statement.
How many examples throughout the course of history can you find somebody who has offered absolute power, the power to subject people to any type of rule? Let's look at Caesar in Rome, what he did with the Roman Empire, declared himself the emperor. Let's look at Napoleon in France. He was beloved by the French. He became an emperor in France. Lenin in the Soviet Union becoming the Tsar of Russia. George Washington was in a similar spot after the American Revolution, and he didn't take the power. He could have been a monarch. He could have been a king. He chose not to. After the Revolutionary War, the United States was a blank canvas. George Washington, the Continental Congress, came up with this system of government on the fly, on their own. If you look at what they just overcame, the British Empire at the time was the juggernaut. It could be argued that no empire in the history of the world was more powerful than the British Empire was in the 1700s. Look at the great sports upsets in the last 100 years. Michigan Appalachian State, the Soviets getting beat on the Miracle on Ice. This was even bigger than that at the time. George Washington was revered by his countrymen. He was a reluctant hero. He didn't want the power. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon and be a farmer. He didn't have a formal education past the age of 14. Truly an underdog story from the get-go. Simply put, I won't beat a dead horse. For the United States government at the time, a convergence of a right place, the right time, was for a leader like George Washington to take hold. And it sparked the beginning of Western civilization as we know it. The first democracy since Greece, universally regarded as one of the best presidents we've ever had, and the only president who's ever won every single electoral vote, and he did that twice. I'm a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln saved the country, but he didn't establish the country. George Washington's role and his stature was more than Abraham Lincoln for what he had to overcome to get the country as an upstart. This upstart company.
You went 3 seconds over. So
that's close.
I'm gonna go ahead and write down -1.
Already in the hole. There we go.
Already in the hole. But very good opening statement, though. I felt moved.
There we go. That was the goal.
All right. Rhett, opening statement now.
While I take nothing away from General Washington and his role in the origination and creation of this country, the country in George Washington's time faced a common enemy in the British, and once the British were beat, it was all one happy family. It was the newlywed phase of America. Everybody was happy on the same time. They all loved Washington. Fast forward 70 some odd years, and you get Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, who had arguably, although it's not really that arguable, the toughest term in office as far as the country around him and the country he was leading at the time. He came into a country already getting ready to split, and his presidency and where he stood on the issue of slavery at the time split a nation. He came into a split nation. He came into infighting. The honeymoon phase was over and war was breaking out within our home. But he led this country through the bloodiest war in its history because both sides were made up entirely of those of our country. He led us through the bloodiest war in our country. He ended and got us out of probably the most disgusting skeleton in the closet of American history with slavery. And he brought people together. He brought the Union back together. And it could be argued, if not for his untimely death in his second term, had Lincoln been president during Reconstruction, we wouldn't have dealt with all the issues we've dealt with since then. I'm going to show you tonight exactly why Abraham Lincoln is the best president we've ever had. I guess I get docked points too, huh?
Yeah.
Dude, yeah.
Okay.
Fair is fair.
We're in the negative already.
All right. Well, we are already both losing apparently, but maybe one of us will suck a little less throughout the rest of these arguments. And if you're on Facebook, you're going to have to find out just how much we suck tomorrow on the full episode. You know you're going to be dealing with election chaos. You know you're going to want to rip your hair out. You know the only presidents you really want to hear about are George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So be sure you go check us out. For those on YouTube and on the podcast, we will be right back. And we are back. Welcome back. Opening statements have been given. Bennett, it's time to move into our predetermined topics as handed down by the committee over the debates that have put you in charge.
And we have been shared the questions in advance. Just to get that out there.
I feel something.
Who built the cages, Elrod?
No comment.
All right.
You did.
Now, before we talk about their time in the office and as the leader of our country, let's kind of take a minute first to kind of look at these men before their presidency. What kind of upbringing did they have? What profession were they in? Anything of note that I should know that might sway my decision one way or the other? And I'm going to be nice. I'm going to give y'all 3 minutes.
There we go.
On this one, just on this one. And I'm going to start with you, Elrod. Tell me about pre-presidential life of George Washington.
We're going to go back to 1732. That's, of course, the year that George Washington was born. He was born in, it wasn't a poor family, but it was a very rich family in Virginia. His father died when he was really young. He did not have a formal education past the age of 14. That's just truly phenomenal. Early in his life, he goes on a trip to Barbados in 1751, and he contracts smallpox. And it was a very bad ordeal for him. He had a permanent scar on his face. But it was actually a bit of fortune for him, because later on, when he's with his men, commanding them in the Revolutionary War, he's immune to smallpox because he already had it. He started out training with the Virginia Regiment, which is basically like a militia in Virginia. He wanted to be a British officer. That's what he wanted to be. But he at every point in his life, he's trying to get the blessing of Great Britain, and he just can't get it. Well, in the French and Indian War, he was leading the Virginia militia against the Indians on the frontier. He actually started the French-Indian War by his decision to kill a French officer. That's a little unknown footnote in history. After the French-Indian War, he comes back. He wants to be a commissioned British officer, and Britain says no. He marries Martha Washington, one of the richest one of the richest women in the Commonwealth of Virginia at the time. So he acquires a lot of land, a lot of prestige. So he's finally getting that notoriety that he wants. He becomes a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. You then have taxes on tobacco and tea that come into play. And this is hurting George Washington's bottom line and other people in Virginia. He called the taxes that the British were imposing as an invasion of her rights and privileges. This is when the Revolutionary War breaks out. He becomes the commanding general of the Continental Army, partially because he's one of the only people that has military experience. He got it by default. He got it over John Hancock. He declined a salary. Over the next couple of years with the Revolutionary War, his army was underfunded. They were outmatched. Many times, he didn't win many battles on the battlefield. His trademark was, let's inflict as much pain as we can on these people and just hightail it out of there. Eventually, Great Britain is not going to want to fight a war. We're 3,000 miles away. They're bleeding money, and public opinion is going to become nada. So this leads to Yorktown. If you've seen The Patriot, where they entrenched Cornwallis at Yorktown. Last thing I'll say, real briefly, this I go over a little bit, but this is one of the footnotes that people really don't know about American history. At Yorktown, Cornwallis was so disgusted that he was going to have to surrender to the Americans that he didn't show up to the surrender event. He sent one of his assistants, and he said, do not surrender to Washington. Surrender to the French that's with him. They offer his sword. The French says, no, you got to give it to Washington. And Washington didn't want to take it because he feels kind of shunned. So he has his assistant take the sword of Cornwallis. So that is a little unknown, also unknown footnote in history, and that sets the stage for his politics, which we'll discuss here in a second.
All right. We're at 3 minutes. Tell me a little bit about Abe Lincoln and a little bit more of his life before becoming president.
1809, Abraham Lincoln is born in a small cabin on a farm in Kentucky. Now, Elrod talks about that George Washington wasn't born into a wealthy family. He didn't have formal education past the age of 14. Abraham Lincoln was born into a dirt poor family, and he had 0 years of any formal education. He was born into a family. His dad had quite a bit of property in Kentucky, or so he thought. Turns out several years later that they didn't actually own the land that his dad had because there were some title issues. And they end up, basically, he thought he had all these hundreds and hundreds of acres, and he had 18. So not long, or maybe even before that, Abraham Lincoln's mother dies of what they called milk sickness. It's a poisoning from drinking milk from a cow that had ate a certain type of plant that actually killed her. You got to remember, medicine wasn't then what it is now. He ends up moving to Indiana for a while. He taught himself to read, and therefore all his education he got was self-taught. Like I said, he had no formal education. He was the epitome of the American dream. He came from absolutely nothing, taught himself everything through his work ethic. Wow, I'm already through a minute and a half. Couple more things. I'm going to leave out a lot here of interest. He taught himself by reading to become an attorney. He became a lawyer in Illinois with no formal education, no primary school, no secondary education, no law school. He taught himself by reading books, and he wasn't finally admitted to the Illinois State Bar. He was in and out of politics a lot, jumping back and forth between practice and law, and he was a senator in Illinois. A trait of his that became a big deal in his presidency that he honed really as an attorney was his ability to talk, his ability to be an orator. He became one of the greatest orators in our country's history, as you can tell by the Gettysburg Address. All these other speeches he gave. And I'm leaving out a lot, but there's one thing I want to fit in here in the last 15 seconds. He was very athletic for a young man, and he was actually a great wrestler. And this is not, I'm going to go a few seconds over because he did. When he moved out from his father and moved out on his own in Illinois, he moved into a town, and there was basically a band of bullies that like to pick on new people in town. And there's a lot of different variations of what actually happened, but some guys gassed him up and gassed up the leader of these bullies. And they ended up getting in a wrestling match. And Lincoln pretty much dominated this guy until the rest of this band of bullies started to surround him. And Lincoln got up and put his back against the wall and said, "I will fight every single one of you on the condition that we do it once at a time. I won't fight all of you at once, but if we go one at a time, I'll fight every single one of you." And from that point on, the leader of the bullies said, "Nope, never mind, you're fine." And they were great friends for the rest of their life after that.
I don't think I ever heard that story. It's interesting. Must have been the couple of Hogan leg drops of the first guy. They backed up after that.
He raised the people's eyebrow on him.
Yeah, that's probably where that came from.
Well, I mean, he was the people's president, so, I mean, it makes sense.
It does make sense. It all's coming full circle. All right. I don't want to give away y'all's big grand finale finish here, but I do have a spoiler alert. Both of these men became president of the United States.
Wow. I mean, you just ruined it for everybody.
But how did they become president? What was their path to presidency? Rut, I'll start with you. Tell me a little bit about how he became president.
All right. Well, this will be definitely a condensed version here with these time limits. But he was a senator from the state of Illinois, and he had gotten out of politics. He had gone back to being a lawyer in that world. And then with the slavery issue, that was bubbling. It was bubbling. It was almost to the top, and he had a strong stance on it. And there were folks that wanted him to run for president. And he, while not as educated as other men running for president, people really liked him. He had a very much likability factor. He was a great speaker. And he had recently switched from being a Whig. He was part of the Whig Party when he was a senator, to being a Republican, which was a fairly new party at the time. He ran in the 1960 election against four gentlemen. There were four main guys. We're kind of indoctrinated nowadays that there's only two choices. There were four main choices in that election. There was Mr. Lincoln. There was a John Breckinridge, who was part of the Southern Democratic Party. There was Tennessean John Bell. No, not the one that was haunted, but the other one, the former senator, the Constitutional Union Party. And then there was Stephen Douglas, the Democrat from Illinois, whose seat Lincoln had took in the senator race. And they had some very famous debates. Lincoln won that election without winning. He dominated the North. He dominated out West. He did not get a single vote in 9 of the southern states. In all of the southern states, he took 2 counties, both of those being in Missouri. But even without the South, he dominated so much in the North and out West that he became the 16th president of the United States.
And one footnote that he just said, that I talked to him about this earlier, there was an old newspaper from the day after Lincoln was, after the election where he won, from Charleston, South Carolina. And it talked about how everybody in Charleston was happy that Lincoln won, even though they didn't vote for him. And someone said, "What does that mean?" It meant that the people in Charleston were so happy because they were going to leave the Union finally. They were just happy that they knew that that his election was going to force South Carolina to leave the Union.
Now, right, when you said John Bell, I immediately thought of Bell Witch. How fun would it have been if it was that John Bell,
Well, you know,
one
when
that
I
was
first
being haunted by this witch and his whole family?
I did some research. John Bell from Tennessee.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Bell Witch haunted the Bell family, who the patriarch of the Bell
Mhm.
family was John Bell. There was several years
Adams,
difference
Tennessee.
there.
Yeah.
But from everything I can tell, there was no relation, oddly enough, because I looked for that connection for quite a bit this afternoon before we started recording, and I could not find a connection. But that was
In
my
Andrew
first
Jackson's diary, he talks about going out to Adams to the Bell Witch House, and he said everything you hear is 100% true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is where we're going off the rails. Bennett, I know sometimes you listen to it. Elrod, do you ever listen to the last podcast on the left?
I do not.
They're fantastic, guys. They're a fantastic podcast. They have no idea who we are, but guys, if you're listening, watching this, go check out Last Podcast on the Left. It's
Mm-hmm.
great. They look at a lot of scary stuff, a lot of paranormal stuff. But they had an episode just a few weeks ago, a couple episodes on the Bell Witch, and talks about when Andrew Jackson was there. And one of his buddies that was with him thought that, oh, this witch is stupid, yada, yada, yada. And supposedly he came in talking a lot of smack because he thought it was all baloney. And apparently the Bell Witch just beat the hell out of this guy
Mm-hmm.
while they were in the house, and really embarrassed him for not taking her seriously. Go check out their podcast on that. It's really interesting.
Is that the same guy that or maybe it's a different one? That my favorite part of that podcast was the guy that went into the house and says, "I'm going to wrestle this this spirit."
It was a different guy, but that
It's
was
a different
hilarious
guy.
too.
This guy is like, I guess he's like a manly man, you know. He's because he was being considered like a big dude for back then. He comes in this house and he's like, I'm going to wrestle that witch. Where are you at? I'm right here. And of course, like, you know, she would make a noise or something. He would be diving across the room trying to tackle this entity, and she's just making fun of him the whole time. It did not go well for him. He looked like an idiot. Very interesting.
Very.
All right. We'll get back on the rails a little bit. Maybe we'll do Bell Witch some other time.
I think we should.
We should. Elrod, how did Mr. Washington become our first president?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't know this. The first 8 years of this country, we were not governed by the U.S. Constitution. This was the Articles of Confederation. A lot of states, including a lot of the southern states, are very reluctant about forming a country just because they just shed themselves from Great Britain. They wanted their own autonomy. But this was a total disaster, the Articles of Confederation. There were so many shady things going on. They were not strong. Tax issues, it was a mess. So all the states understand that in order to compete with Britain, France, they need to form a country, and that's where they had Congress, they had a convention, and this is where George Washington, by acclamation, becomes the one candidate. When they had the vote for the president, he got every single electoral vote. Back then, the total count, the number of people that will vote in this election is somewhere around 150 million for the 2020 election. Back in 1789, that total count for the 13 colonies was 43,000. 43,000 total people voted in that election. He becomes president. There was a bigger debate on what his title should be. A lot of people said it should be Your Highness, Your Excellency. It was George Washington and his people that came up with president. It's the first time that term had been used. He didn't want to be a monarch. He didn't want to rule as a monarch. He wanted the modern president that we know today comes from George Washington. He was not part of any political party. Later on, you'll see the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which is synonymous with the Federalists want a strong federal government. Anti-Federalists, they want a loose government. George Washington warned us of what political parties would do to this country all the way back in 1789, and spot on in what they've done to this country, both of them.
So basically, what you're saying was the people are like, "Hey, we need you to lead us. You know, we need you to be a great leader of this country." And he was just like,
he was at Mount Vernon chilling
Yeah.
with his wife. He didn't want to leave the farm. He was making money. They just got rid of the British, got rid of the taxes. He was chilling out. He didn't want it, but he was kind of forced into it because he understood that if he didn't do it, someone else would, and they would become Napoleon. That's what his biggest fear was.
Well, we'll just read right into this next subject. Since he did become president, it's neat, that he was the one and his people that came up with president. Tell me about some of the successes that he had while he was in office, and some of the strengths that was in his favor while he was during his time as president.
Well, he established the whole thing, or modern system. He established the executive branch. Today he appointed all the judges himself. He brought a guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton, famous from the Hamilton play, and he was basically the guy that set up all of the economic policies. And Alexander Hamilton wanted a British-style system of a strong bank, strong system, a central control. People like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison did not like this because in their mind, they just shed themselves from Britain. You're going back to a British-style system. But George Washington knew that in order to compete on a global stage with France and Great Britain, you had to have a strong economic system. He actually, there was some rebellions early in his presidency. And instead of sending a military officer, George Washington gets on his horse and puts those rebellions down himself. Which you would never see today with any president. What else did he do? Under his leadership, there was 12 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights came as a result of him wanting to include more rights. He was a very big free speech proponent. He established the U.S. Navy under his leadership. The American merchant ships were getting blown to pieces in the Caribbean from pirate ships. They knew that we need a navy to protect the economic interest of this country. Another thing that he did, which was controversial, France helped us a lot in the American Revolution. Without France's help, there is no America right now. But George Washington always wanted to gain favor with the British. So his policy was, we're going to be neutral in any transaction or any war with Britain and France. There was a big war between Britain and France. The country remains neutral. And we'll talk more about that under the weaknesses here in a minute to his president.
I can hardly wait. All right. Other than being able to grow a pretty sweet beard, what's some of the strengths? What made Abraham Lincoln the greatest?
There were a lot of great qualities about Abraham Lincoln, and to try to condense these into 2 minutes is impossible. But just the highlights. First of all, he was a presence. He's the tallest president we ever had at 6'4", and he was, like I said, a fantastic orator. And to those who knew Abraham Lincoln, he was just a generally likable guy. He was known for sitting around and telling stories. He was very funny. Sarcastic. He had jokes. If you've ever seen the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis playing Lincoln, that kind of shows that side of him. There's especially one joke in that movie that I don't have time, but go look at his George Washington joke in that movie, which supposedly is a true story. It's hilarious. But his ability to speak to people, he was known for his great speeches. Obviously, we've already discussed the Gettysburg Address. His inaugural addresses are both pretty famous speeches. He had a speech when he was running for Senate in Illinois, called the House Divided speech, trying to bring people together. Obviously, his biggest accomplishment is all the work he did for civil rights and ending slavery. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which ordered the Army to protect former slaves and bring them in while the Civil War was going on. His biggest thing that he was most proud of that he pushed for was the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, that he did see passed in the House not very long before he was assassinated. But that brought an end to slavery, and something he will always be remembered for. That's probably his biggest win, his biggest strength, and he ended the Civil War. He brought the country back together.
All right. Flip the script a little bit, and let's discuss some of their weaknesses or some of their defeats that they may have experienced in office or before office or after office. Basically the stuff you don't hear so much about, in your history class. And Rhett, I'll start with you. Tell me about some of the weaknesses of Abraham Lincoln.
There are two main weaknesses to Abraham Lincoln in his time as president, and they really tie hand in hand. He made mistakes and he learned from those, but he was also too trusting of a person. He expected everybody to be as honest and as trustworthy and as good of a person as he was, and a lot of times he gave people too long of a leash. The biggest thing where these two come together is, as the leader, as the president, as the commander in chief of the Union at that time, their armed forces, he had to select generals. And to be honest, he selected some pretty bad generals, some pretty terrible generals. And he was often, especially in a couple cases, very reluctant to change those generals because he trusted what they had told him. He believed in them. He didn't necessarily believe they were as bad a people as the stories he was hearing, because he wasn't there to see how terrible some of these generals were. He trusted them too much and was too indecisive and took too long about replacing them, but eventually he did. And there were a lot of things. Lincoln was in and out of politics. He was never formally educated. He made mistakes along the way. Um, and a lot of times he learned from those mistakes, but he didn't instantly learn from a lot of those mistakes. And really, his biggest weaknesses as a leader was those he selected under him. More specifically, some of the generals he selected during the Civil War, which weren't good people, but he trusted entirely too much.
You are under time too. That's awesome. That's the first time. I can relate to Lincoln being indecisive. I go into the break room at work and I've got a dollar bill. It takes me 25 minutes to figure out which chips I want. You know how long it'd take me to probably pick a general? That's a true story. I've had lines behind me before, and I just have to step to the side. That's embarrassing. Let me tell you. When you're like, go ahead. Happens. All right, Elrod. Let me fix my clock here. Okay. 2 minutes.
The two weaknesses, Washington has two as well. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which prohibited, made it a federal crime to assist in a slave leaving the South or leaving anywhere. It was a black mark that you're still feeling the effects with Lincoln in 1861 from this act. In 1794, though, you have the Slave Trade Act, which was kind of unique at the time. It prohibited the United States from participating in the slave trade from another country. It's a really odd paradigm that you see with his stances on slavery. Now, we talked about Great Britain. We talked about France earlier. Without France, there is no United States of America. There's not. They provided ships, provided troops to help us beat the British. But George Washington was always very pro-British. He wanted to be a British subject all of his life. And he thought that, if we sided with the British, our fortunes would be better in the long run rather than France. Well, a lot of people didn't see it that way. Thomas Jefferson wanted us to be aligned with France. He thought we had an obligation to be behind those who helped us. So did James Madison. Well, they may be wrong, because a couple years later, James Madison becomes president. He aligns us with France, and the White House is burning. The British torched the city of Washington. So maybe George Washington wasn't a total idiot about the interplay between France and Great Britain. He took a lot of heat from the anti-federalist group, Jefferson, Hamilton, that group, for siding with the French. But who's laughing now after the city of Washington's burning in 1814? Maybe he was right about that.
You're right. Who is laughing now? All right. Last topic here before we jump into the closing. Elrod, start with you. Tell me about the legacy of Mr. Washington, and what kind of story did he leave behind?
Yeah. So there was a great book in 2011, won a Pulitzer Prize. It was his biography by a guy named Ron Chernow. And here's what he said about Washington. He said he restored American credit and assumed state debt. He created a bank, a mint, a coast guard, a customs service, a diplomatic corps, introduced the first accountant, the tax structure, and budgetary procedures. He maintained peace at home and abroad. He inaugurated a navy. He bolstered the army, shored up coastal defenses and infrastructure, proved that the country could regulate commerce and negotiate treaties himself. He protected frontier settlers. He subdued Indian uprisings, and he created law and order amid rebellion. And he adhered to the writing of the Constitution. He didn't veer off from what that document said that they had just written. Most of all, he's shown a disbelieving world that a Republican government could prosper without spineless or disorderly or reverting to authoritarian rule. We may have drifted from that in modern time, but back then, George Washington was by the book. That's George Washington, by the book. He built the foundation for this country, the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch. He built this country along with the other founding fathers. He laid the framework for Western civilization to modern day. There's been more than 900 books written about Washington. He is consistently either 1A or 1B in terms of great presidents in this country by any historian that you will talk to. Without Washington, you don't have Lincoln. You may have a king for 50 years without the leadership that Washington had. Our nation's capital, named after him. A state named after him. That's a legacy of George Washington.
Very nice, very nice. Basically, George pretty much just invented everything. Starting out, one point though, I did not realize. Said that he created Law and Order. I did not know that show had been around that long. I mean, I know it's been around for a minute, but I didn't know it was that old.
It is true story.
Apparently, that's probably the most impressive thing about all that.
Done.
All right. Legacy of Mr. Lincoln.
I think the impact he had on a broken country, on a broken sense of thinking, that was really around during, no offense, Mr. Washington's time, that those people of color were lesser people. That was a commonly running theme in the 1860s. But what Lincoln did in his time, really, Abraham Lincoln was a fixer. He got people together. He used his stature and his presence when he needed to. But one of those people that always knew what to say, always knew how to convey what he wanted. The British almost got involved on the Confederate end of the Civil War. And Lincoln was able to talk that basically out of happening. He took a country that was, everybody attributes that, the Civil War was under Lincoln, the country split under Lincoln. That was bubbling to the brim before he ever got in office. When he got in office, yes, it happened, but he brought the country back together. He ended slavery, in a sense, bringing people back together. Had he not been assassinated in Ford Theater, maybe his efforts there would have been much longer lasting and much quicker to resolve, which I'll talk about a little in closing statements. And honestly, when everybody thinks of Abraham Lincoln, a lot of times you think of, he was shot in Ford Theater, but he was shot because of his stance on slavery. He was not wavering on his stances on things. He essentially died as a martyr for the cause, a cause that we see all these years later was the right thing. He died for the cause, but he died as a martyr. He ended slavery. He brought the country back together.
And he did. I'm going to jump right into our closing statements here. But before I do, just want to take a second to say what an honor it would be or would have been to had met either one of these gentlemen, and shake their hand and kind of experience some of the stuff they did firsthand. And actually, it'd probably be quite an experience to meet any president that we've had in our country. I mean, for example, look at Forrest Gump. He got to meet 3 presidents. He met JFK while he was an All-American and told him he had to go pee. He got the Medal of Honor from Lyndon Johnson and told Richard Nixon that he was staying at the Hotel Ebbets and got moved over to Watergate and blew up that whole scandal. So I just hope one day I could at least meet one president, let alone 3. So that's just my 2 cents on the
I know
matter.
you too well. I saw that coming a mile away.
Uh-huh.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Okay, anywho, moving along, no shame. Elrod, start with you. Give me your best closing argument as to why George Washington is our greatest president of all time.
This is simple. This is so simple, Bennett, right? If George Washington was a narcissist, he'd have been King Washington. It's as simple as that. Or if someone else more ambitious had been in his spot, we'd have a monarchy. That's the way we were trending, was a monarch. George Washington single-handedly said, no, I don't want that power. That I cannot think of a single time down through history where someone rejected power. Just, it's not human nature. Human nature is, I want the power, I want the control. George Washington just wanted to be a farmer at Mount Vernon. That's all he wanted. There's 3 quotes. George Washington has some of the best quotes of all time. And it's important in this day and age. On honesty, he said, I'll hold the maxim no less to the public than to private affairs, that honesty is the best policy. On bad excuses, he once said, it's better to offer no excuse than a bad one. And on truth, he said, truth will ultimately prevail where pains is taken to bring it to light. And finally, his stance on political parties. He was almost like a prognosticator on how he said, if you all go down this route of trying to have tribalism, trying to have 2 political parties, it will rip you apart. Political parties in general was not the Civil War. It was basically an idea of slavery that ripped the country apart. But what's ripping the country apart today is political parties. I really believe that. And that is what Washington was railing against back in 1792. In his final address he gave as president, he said, he warned that eventually, if you go down this route, there will be no America. That's the Cliff Notes. That's the 3-minute closing statement version of that speech. But he was spot on. The work that he did to establish this country cannot be understated. And his stance to not take the power, it's simply mind-boggling to me that across the Atlantic, you had Napoleon. At the same time Washington was coming to power, Napoleon was reigning in France. He took the power. He became emperor, and there was a bloody revolution that followed. And a lot of people, they were suspicious of Washington. And like, why doesn't he want this power? Maybe he does. Maybe this is just a facade that he's doing. But he never did. After he left, he went back home to Mount Vernon, and he lived peacefully. It's truly amazing. And Mount Vernon is a really cool place to go if you've never been. It's a really cool place.
I've not been. Maybe you can take us.
I'll take you.
Awesome. Got it on tape. We're going, right?
I'm down.
All right. Close us out here.
As I mentioned earlier, Abraham Lincoln, his time as President of the United States, he faced a tougher tenure in the White House than anyone had before or anyone had since. To take nothing away from George Washington, he was unselfish. He did have power in his fingertips and did the right thing of delegating it to people, but he lived in a time where people were going to go with what he said because they were all on the same page in this country at that time. If George Washington had said, "Hey, I want to be king," the entire country would have been like, "King Washington." The country was nowhere near on the same side in 1860. They're nowhere near on the same side in 2020, but that's a different. We're not getting into politics, but this country was split in half, and he fixed it. This country was okay with, in large part, something that we look back on with 2020 vision, pun intended, as this horrible, terrible thing. And it was Abraham Lincoln who was the loudest voice that said, no, it's not. And he set out to end that thing, and he did. What Abraham Lincoln did for people of color in this country was unprecedented. And the fact that he not only got what he wanted, but the country still came back together, even though half the country was against what he wanted, is incredible. Now, because of those beliefs, we know he was assassinated in Ford Theater not long after he was reelected. But if you look at everything else he fixed, if Abraham Lincoln doesn't die and is the president throughout that second term, during Reconstruction, and could have put in motion some of the plans that we had, we don't have the civil rights issues of the 1960s that we have. All the civil rights could very well have been squashed back in the 1860s and not hang around for 100 years. That movement's what opened the door to women voting. Elrod said there were only 43,000 votes for Washington because women and black people couldn't vote. There was a lot more than 43,000, but the way he fixed this country and turned it into a more moral society and brought us together when it was all falling apart is something no other president can boast ever. And hopefully we'll never have to again.
You know, both of y'all give very, very good points and very convincing arguments. And it's really extremely hard to compare these two because of the time frame. What I got out of it is I feel like both men were right for the job at the right time. I think we needed Washington at the beginning, and we needed Lincoln there what was it? Some 70, 80 years later.
We
Mhm.
need Kanye in 2020.
We need Kanye. He just saved us. But so I think they were both the perfect people for the time. When you talk about Washington, we owe a lot to George Washington. He basically pretty much helped build the thing from ground. You hear that all the time. Oh, I helped build this place from the ground up. He pretty much did. And yeah, he definitely could have been. You know what? Yeah, having this power is pretty cool. I'm just going to be king of the United States, and then we could have just rolled with it. But he didn't do that, and a lot of the stuff that he set up is still what we follow today. Years and years and hundreds of years later. And then you have Lincoln, and like you said, he came in, had the toughest term when the country was just completely separated, and he pretty much comes in and brings everybody back together. He had to, who else could have came in at that time and did what he did to bring the whole country back together, and what he did for all people at that time. So to me, I kind of like to, if you swap the roles, and if Washington was in Lincoln's shoes, or if Lincoln's in Washington's shoes, what they, what kind of outcome we would have. I don't know. It's hard to tell, but when you add everything up,
Before you make your decision, this isn't trying to get any points, but one thing that this president did that no other presidents have done since Lincoln and Washington was they didn't just want yes men in their cabinet. Lincoln had a team of rivals. George Washington had people like Jefferson, people like Hamilton, people that hated one another. I mean, heck, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr got into a gunfight with one another, all in his cabinet. That's what you don't see these days. People surround themselves with yes men. Most of these men did not want to do that. They just wanted the best men for the job.
Lincoln's first vice president was a Democrat when he was a Republican.
that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's different times too. Like y'all talked about, in the beginning, I feel like everybody was on board on the same page, and then by the time Lincoln took office, it's a completely different story, and everybody's not on the same page. So I think they're 1A and 1B. If you go through on your Google machine and type in greatest president, they're going to be 1 and 2 on every single one of them. But for me, I think the greatest president that we've had up until this point is going to be Abraham Lincoln. So, Rut, you have convinced me, Abraham Lincoln. It's tough though. I mean, it boils down to what all he did to bring us all back together. Really, is what it boils down to, and how tough of a term he had, as opposed to granted, everything that Washington did for us was amazing, but he walked right in there like a boss with no pushback.
And Elrod didn't even mention a cherry tree.
I didn't, because it ain't true. I told you I wasn't going to tell a lie.
And what about the wooden teeth? Is that false?
Wouldn't you? This is correct, but there was no cherry tree. That was a urban myth that was put into a biography a few years after his death.
His teeth were made of wool. Think you mean wood. You know what I forgot to mention and I meant to put in there, but the time limits all threw me off. You want to know what the greatest thing that Abraham Lincoln, one of his fantastic things he did when he was in presidency? Yes, he freed the slaves. That's his greatest accomplishment. But his second greatest accomplishment, Bill S. Preston, Esquire, and Ted Theodore Logan got a time machine. And they went back and brought Mr. Lincoln back with them to San Dimas, California in the 1980s. And he stood on a stage and delivered a speech so good, he took them from failing their history class to getting an A so that Ted did not have to go to military school. Now, for those of you who don't believe this, I have proof. It's called Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Go check it out.
Never
And
seen it.
Mr. What?
All right, we'll see everybody next week. Everyone's going to go watch a movie.
And I want to end this show, in this topic, the way that Abraham Lincoln ended the history report for Bill and Ted's history report. And that is with a party on, dudes. This has been another week of Convince Me Show. Join us next week where we are going. Hey, this is 2 weeks in a row. We know what next week's show is. Next weekend, not this weekend, but next weekend, once everybody's, let's be serious, nobody's going to be done with the election drama. But once everybody's trying to be done with the election drama, it's the Masters weekend in
November,
which is strange, but we're looking back at two of the greatest of all time, Tiger Woods versus Jack Nicklaus. That's what we've got on deck for you next week. Thanks for joining us this week. PSA, going back to Bill and Ted. Half of you listening to this after these election results are probably pissed off, and half of you are very excited. But to quote Bill and Ted, I will just say this. PSA from myself, and I assume my cohorts here at the Convince Me Show. Be excellent to each other. Whether you're winning or losing, don't be a douchebag. Lincoln would have said, we're in this together. We're in this together. We'll be in this together next week when we're hitting the links. From Lincoln to the links. From Martha Washington to the Masters. That was a terrible one.
No,
that was the first hymn that came to my mind. We will see you guys next week. And until then, for Mr. Bennett, Mr. Elrod, and myself, peace.